I always felt that having my grandparents around me is very important. I knew that she hadn't spoken about the Holocaust much in her history, in her past, her family. And she always told me and my sister, like, whenever you want to, pick up the phone and say, listen, Granny, can I speak to you about something? In school, whenever teacher would ask, any of you have a Holocaust survivor in your family, I would raise my hand straight away and tell them the story.
My dad had a shoe factory, so we lived very well, had an apartment in a very nice part of the city. We were a family of 2 parents and 4 children. An older brother, myself, then there was a younger brother and a little sister. She was very bright and very pretty, very beautiful, and she adored me. I was the hero. My older brother was physically handicapped. He was damaged during birth and he couldn't walk, but there was nothing wrong with him mentally. 1st of September, we were coming back to school. We were coming back from vacation. The whole family and all the coffers with the stuff and the helpers and everybody was on the train. And the train was full, everybody was panicking and wanted to be at home when the war started. Within 8 days they came to the town. I mean, the Poles were fighting with they didn't have any defense. They had sabers. And these were big tanks, and the army was like, the German army was organized. They were within 14, I think, I don't remember the days, but within, I think, 14 days, they occupied half of Poland. They were wearing these black uniforms with a skull on top, and they installed loudspeakers all over the town, spreading hate propaganda, and Hitler's speeches went on for hours and hours. So if somebody says that they didn't know what was going on, that was impossible, whether they liked it or not, because he never made any secrets of what he was going to do to the Jews. We had white armbands with a blue, this Magen David, the Star of David, yeah. At that time and all the time afterwards, I looked not like a Jewish girl. I looked like the advert of Goebbels for a German. Every second German stopped me in the street. Why are you wearing this? They didn't see a Jew looking like this. They had all these propaganda pictures picturing Jewish people like, they looked like monkeys. I've never seen anybody like this. And looking like animals, not like people. My dad was still working. They didn't pay him, but he had a collection of gold rubles, and that saw us through a lot. The ghetto was established in 1941. There were 30,000 people. They had two ghettos there, and the one that we were in was called the Big Ghetto, but it was really a small place. It was around the Jewish quarters where the synagogue was. 10 people in a room. There were terrible conditions. They would come and knock on doors and take people out and shoot them there and then, and they would do the most terrible things. And they used to send people to work. Up to now, we survived because of my father's job that he had. My mother worked in another place there, but my older brother was still with us, and my little sister was with us. Not for long. my younger brother was taken to the armament factory. We never knew what happened to him during the war. We never saw him till the end of the war, and 2 years later, after the end of the war. And he never talked about it. His own family doesn't know where he was, what he did. In 1942, they took out of the 30,000, they took 20,000 people out of the ghetto, and they had to stand there, and most of them went straight to the death camps. And the small ghetto they shot everybody, and some other people had to bury them in mass graves. I had to get to work at that stage, because if not, they would have deported me with the next lot. I had an abscess on my tooth that was supposed to be filled and had a temporary filling, but there wasn't a dentist in town anymore. So I developed a big abscess here, and I was going to the hospital to lance it or to do something. And my uncle, who lived with us there, it was a small little place, helped to dress me. It was winter, it was very cold. And he pressed on this, and as a result, it burst. So my mother said, "You don't have to go to the hospital now, because we will treat it ourselves." And that same morning, they took everybody from the hospital, and they killed everybody. And my brother went to the hospital, but they shot all the people that were physically disabled. He knew exactly what was happening. He wasn't mentally retarded. He was bright. And he said, he took off his winter coat and he gave it to my mother, and he says, "Give it to someone who will need it. I won't need it anymore." And she came home with a coat. It was March 1944. They closed that little ghetto, and we were the last remnant of that place. And they marched us to the railway station. There were no other Jews. From 30,000, they were the last 300. It was our first concentration camp. And the trip was, as they describe, in a cattle truck, no ventilation, no water, no toilet facilities, tiny little window, and packed people only standing place. And they locked the doors, no light, no nothing. And from Radom, we were taken to the first concentration camp, which was Majdanek, just outside Lublin. We were having one little suitcase each, and we arrived in Majdanek, and it was dismal. Everything was stripped. You had to strip naked in the snow, and they were standing there in full uniform, looking you up and down. Then they sent you to the showers, and then you were given a wooden pair of sort of shoes. They were not shoes, but they had material on top and a thick wooden sole like that. And a striped uniform, a striped dress, and a white handkerchief on the head. And that was all you had in this winter, freezing cold weather. And there, for the first time, we saw the women SS. And in a way, they were terribly cruel. They were awful women. I don't know where they get women with such hatred in them. For what? There were 5 different camps in Majdanek. The 5th camp was a crematorium. We were totally separated from the men, so we didn't know where my father was and what he was doing. 6 weeks in Majdanek. And then they sent us somewhere else, the same story, with the cattle trucks, with the closed wagons, no air, no anything, and we went to the next camp, which was Plazow. They had an enormous camp there. My mother was sent to another camp, and I had a friend. Most of the people there were from Krakow and from the vicinity of Krakow, which was a big country there. The whole south of Poland was a big camp, and in charge of it was this horrible man that was depicted in the film, Schindler's List. I think it was the best film that portrayed that camp. That was the camp where it took place. And he was sitting there amusing himself by shooting at people. If he didn't like somebody, he shot them. And they divided us into groups of 10. So, like the Romans, 10 women, 10 in a team, and we had to push these terribly heavy and difficult wagons on the rails to take the stones to the quarry. It was a hell of a job. We could hardly manage. And there were shootings and hangings, and there was no crematorium there. Only a hill where they used to burn the people, and all the ashes used to fly over us. Every day we had these ashes flying over us, and we knew it was from the hill where they were burning the bodies. Doesn't matter, stand and wait for them to come and count us about 8, 8:30, and you had to stand to attention for hours in this freezing weather. And one day, the woman chief of the SS women, her name was Elsa Erich, and she had the most steely eyes. I've never seen such cold eyes in my life. And they were wearing a uniform with a divided skirt and not a hat, but like a little army sort of cap without a thing, like the soldiers used to wear. And they were, in many ways, they were worse than the men. They were terribly cruel. And this particular Elsa took delight in punishing children or hitting them or sending them off somewhere, and then she was worse than anybody. She was not normal. She was like a wild animal. She was a terrible woman. Anyway, she was looking for a helper in the house, a domestic servant. And of all these thousands of people, she picked me. Maybe because I didn't look Jewish, maybe because, I don't know, I have no idea. How old are you? 18. Where are you from? From there. And I could speak German, obviously. There was the head, this Elsa Erich. Then there were 2 young SS women. The one was called Meindl, and the other was called Two-Stitch. The Meindl girl was from a farm up north, and she was taking pictures of me to send home that the Jews don't look all like in the pictures. The soldiers in Russia needed blood. Who do you think they took it from? The prisoners in the camps. So they used to raid on a Sunday when nobody was working, just resting. They used to come to the barrack and empty a barrack and take them to the Red Cross. There was a Red Cross part, and take blood from them as much as they could, not just 1 pint or half a pint, but a lot of people died because they didn't have food or liquid to replace the blood. And one morning I was lying on the top bunk and trying to rest a bit from the heavy work, and there is the raid. So first comes the SS with a red cross on his arm with 2 guards, and they're emptying the whole barrack. People are trying to run away. The women knew what was waiting for them if he came from the Red Cross barrack. But it was like a death sentence, because it was very difficult to recover from this when they emptied you of blood. And and I was thinking, what do I have to do? There is no other entrance, only this door that they came in, and they had 2 guards there, so there's no ways I can go through the door and try and escape. And all the women that tried to escape through the window, it was impossible. You couldn't. So I stayed on that top bunk, and I didn't move. What will be, will be. So they all emptied the whole barrack, and this S-man noticed that I was still there. So he comes to the bed and he says, "What's wrong with you? Why aren't you there?" So I said, "I've got typhus." Which wasn't truth. I didn't have typhus, I didn't have anything. So he puts his hand on my forehead and it's as cold as a cucumber. So he says, "Really?" So I said, "Yes." So he left me and he went. So that was another escape. My father was killed there. And he was an upright citizen. He was always fair with his workers. He couldn't come to terms with this whole situation. And his family was dispersed. He didn't know where and what. And the child was gone, and my mother was gone to another camp. And he was killed by one of the couple, one of the overseers there. He was beaten to death. And then from Plazow, we were sent to Auschwitz. And that was an experience. Just before Yom Kippur, in October, it was snowing, it was freezing cold. It was nearly the end of the war. It was 1944. And I met my mother there at Birkenau, and my friend. My best friend from Poland was there in Birkenau, and they both came running to me, but they were very hungry. I was very happy that they're alive. That's the first thought. My mother was sent to another camp. I was sent with another 100 young girls to the proper camp, Auschwitz, that was called Musterlager. They took us off the train and we had to line up and again strip, and this terrible, and the men were separated from the women immediately, women and children on one side and the men on the other side. And there stood Dr. Mengele and his cronies, fully dressed in uniforms, and we had to parade in front of them. You can imagine what that felt like. And he was just flicking his finger. If he flicked the finger to the left, the people were going straight to the crematorium. If to the right, they were going to the camp. So we were sorted out, in inverted commas, that way. And those that were strong enough to work, then they sent them to the proper Auschwitz. My sister wasn't there. My sister was already gone with the children's transport. So the mothers were there crying and the fathers, and everybody stood on the Platz where they counted us, and they had loud music blaring over the loudspeakers when they took all the children away. And we knew they were going, where could they take children? She was sent into the ovens. The children were singing when they left. We're given a number, everybody gets tattooed. There's mine still. I wouldn't let them remove it after the war. They came to shave every woman's head. And they're also divided in groups of 10. I cannot describe to you how a girl looks without hair, and this is the last thing they were sort of holding on to. The woman came to cut my hair. The German SS woman has a look around and she looks, stop, don't cut her hair. I was the only one that didn't have the hair shaved, just cut shorter. It was a matter of surviving every minute. And it was for me, because, okay, they didn't cut my hair, but then every one of us got a bundle of clothes. And they were not these striped clothes, they were civilian clothes. And, they took it from the people, obviously, that were killed before. And I got a parcel of clothes, I was told by then, that would have fitted a 12-year-old girl. And the shoes were these, so there my luck ended. The clogs, these clogs that they wear in Holland, those wooden clogs. But they were too small, I couldn't put my foot into them. So I thought to myself, now this is the end. They didn't cut my hair, but they'll bury me now they'll burn me with my hair. As I stood there in the courtyard and I cried, and I don't know how I'm going to survive here in these clothes. I couldn't wear these shoes, stood in the snow, in a micro mini dress, nothing on my head, and in the middle of my tears, and this is as true as I sit here, I hear a voice calling my name. So I can't see who it is because my tears are all over my face and my eyes. And on the other side of the fence, a young chap was standing and calling my name. So he says, "Come to the fence." So I'm coming near the fence, and he says, "Wait right here for 5 minutes. Wait." So I said, "Who are you? What you're doing, who are you?" So he says, "Never mind who I am, I'm in a hurry, I used to work for your dad." So he recognized me, but I didn't know who he was. I had no idea. He was a Jewish chap, and he went away and he came back. He was working with the clothes of the dead people that they just killed, and the ovens, and they gassed them. So he came back and he threw over the fence a parcel for me with clothes. And this was a lifesaver. I'll never forget what was in that parcel, because now I know that I can carry on. There were wonderful shoes with laces, leather shoes. There were stockings, there was underwear, there was a warm dress, and a black velvet coat. The worst thing I remember from Auschwitz was the cold, the freezing cold that used to stand for hours outside and without any purpose, pushing these stones from one place to another. And some people recited poems. That was my job, because we had to learn everything off by heart in those days. And so we kept our minds sort of away from this horrible presence. You had to have a break from it. Hunger is a terrible thing. It's not just being hungry that you come home and eat. It's starvation. There's nothing the next day, there's nothing the following day, and you feel weaker and you look like a skeleton. It's a horrible, horrible feeling. The medical block I did see, because we had 2 girls from my town who had identical twins, and they were very pretty, but you couldn't tell the difference between the one and the other. And he had them there up in the experimental block around, and we saw the girls upstairs in that experimental block. And I still say, "You're lucky, you're warm there," and we sit in the frost and we're absolutely freezing. So she still said, I'll never forget it, she said, "Don't envy us." On the 10th of December is my birthday. I would have had a big party, and I would have getting ready for university. I was put down to go to Rome, to Italy, to study. And now I'm sitting in Auschwitz, and I don't know what tomorrow will be. I had my future mapped up, and it was a lot. And I said, "I'm too young to die. I can't die. I'm too young. I haven't seen anything. I haven't done anything yet. So I've lost everything, but I'm too young to die. I don't want to die." So there was about 3 months altogether in Auschwitz. And then they evacuated. Can you imagine? The Russians came, I think, 2 days after we left. And why are we being marched to another concentration camp? Why? That question never, ever left me. And there were lots of people being killed on the way, just shot because they couldn't walk anymore. The road on both sides was just full of dead bodies, and the snow was red. And that was the biggest shock I've ever had since the beginning of the war. I saw plenty of people dying, being shot, being hanged, being punished, being tortured, but I've never seen a sight like this when we came to the gates of Bergen Belsen. A huge mountain of dead bodies was in front, right to the left of the gate. But if I say huge, it was huge, partly decomposing. That was our first impression of Bergen Belsen. Remember the shock of the conditions that even by standards of Auschwitz, this was the pits. I was clean and free of any vermin till I arrived in Bergen Belsen, and then you couldn't help it. I got sick with typhus. There was no work to do. Because there was no work, there was nothing to do. There were hundreds of people, there were Russian prisoners, there were Poles just sitting and dying. They were sitting and starving and didn't have strength to get up. There was a girl next to me, a Hungarian girl, and all she could say in a broken German was, "I don't want to die, I don't want to die." So I still said to him, then stop shouting, preserve your energy. Don't shout all the time. She was shouting, "I don't want to die," until she died. And people were being burned and people are being shot. And there was no order. It was just, prisoners had to carry the corpses to where they were burning them. But we didn't budge from that one big hall. And eventually that hall was nearly empty. I'm not going to die. I'm too young to die. That was a mantra that I was repeating all the time.
I have just returned from the Belsen concentration camp. But beyond the barrier was a whirling cloud of dust. The dust of thousands of slowly moving people, laden in itself with the deadly typhus germ. And with the dust was a smell sickly and thick, the smell of death and decay, of corruption and filth. I passed through the barrier and found myself in the world of a nightmare. Dead bodies, some of them in decay, lay strewn about the road and along the rutted tracks. On each side of the road were brown wooden huts. There were faces at the windows, the bony, emaciated faces of starving women too weak to come outside, propping themselves against the glass to see the daylight before they died.
But there were not enough doctors, and they established a hospital outside the camp. And yes, and the one thing that annoyed us most of all was that we were closed in the camp and we were not allowed to go out because they didn't want the neighborhood to get all these diseases. That means the Germans or the people that lived around us. So they locked us in the camp and we were not allowed to come out. But they didn't have enough doctors, they didn't have medicines, they had nothing, and they didn't have suitable food for all these people. They were starving and they fed them on this fat meat and things, and people got sick all over again. And the people were dying. There were 30,000 people that died after the liberation. I felt terrible. I lost the only friend I had right through the camps when I was separated from my mother and from my whole family. And she looked after me. She was an intelligent, bright girl. We always had talks about what we learned at school. She studied French and I studied German. We compared notes. It was terrible. And I heard that most of the people that survived from Radom were in Stuttgart. So I went by train. A friend came to fetch me, and we went to Stuttgart. And there I met, my mother came from Poland, so I met her there for the first time after the war. So it was very tearful, but it was happy in a way too, that the two of us at least survived. The times after the war were very difficult. You had to start rebuilding your life. You had to deal with all the past, the terrible past, with all the losses that we didn't have time to deal with it while we were in the camps. But after the war was finished, then we started to think of all the things that happened to us, and there were no psychologists, there were no psychiatrists, there was no help, and we had to work it all out by ourselves. But then my uncle in Paris, he knew that we were there, so he sent for us. Everybody there in France was busy building their lives from the beginning again after the war, and sort of in a way recuperating, but it wasn't a future. I knew that this wasn't our future. And then we had to find my brother. We didn't know where he was. Eventually we found out from the family that he's in Israel already. There was an American woman from the Witzow, from the Zionist organization, who gathered. She collected a lot of young children and youngsters, teenagers that survived the camps, and she brought them to Israel. He was a teenager still. I can't remember. That was already 1 year after the liberation, and then it was 2 years after the liberation. He wasn't 20 yet. And he was taken to this kibbutz on Lake Hulata. For 2 years he stayed and worked on this kibbutz. And then we spent 2 years in France, living with my uncle, and until one of my uncles in Palestine, he organized 2 false passports for us, for me and for my mother. We were determined to get to Palestine, because that's where the rest of the family was. So we had to get to Marseille, and there was a camp of all the Jewish refugees. Some were trying to get illegally to Israel, and we helped pack this famous boat Exodus. I was in Marseille at the time, and a couple of us who were in the camp went to. There were about 1,000, I think about 1,000 people on that boat, and that was the famous book and the picture that they made of this boat that came to Palestine, and they wouldn't let them in. Eventually we went in a little Greek boat. It wasn't a very, very big boat, but it was a nice, comfortable boat. And we arrived in Haifa. No, my little brother was 6 foot tall by the time we met him, and we could hardly recognize him. He didn't meet us in Haifa. He couldn't come. But soon afterwards, the War of Independence broke out in 1948 straight away. And then I went to the army for 2 years, and then a year later, my brother went into the armies. It was just a matter of get hold of yourself and get on. The time in Israel was a healing process. Financially, we were very poor, we didn't have much, but as soon as the state was announced, my mother opened a canteen at the police station in Haifa. And she was doing very well there. We were very close, but it was a rule in the house, we're not talking about the camps. I had a bad time with my nerves. There were times that I couldn't cope with everything. And he was different. He was quiet, he wasn't noisy like the Mediterranean people, and he loved music, which I also did. A lot of things, and we spoke Hebrew. I couldn't speak English.
I took her out a few times before I really fell for her in a big way. And
he never let me go. He went out, and my mother still looked. He came with 2 little nylon shirts that were washed every day, and she couldn't get over it, how poor he looked. And where, what is it? He looked really funny.
We got to know each other better. I proposed to her, and she agreed to marry me. So I had to do something in order to maintain a friendship and be there all the time. So I had to take a job in Israel, in Haifa, and I stayed there for 6 months. That's just to be close to Henia. I was completely smitten then.
We didn't go out for a long time, about 3 or 4 months, and then we got married, and I said I'll come to South Africa for 1 year only to meet the family, and then I go back home. Well, that never happened.
When we arrived in Bloemfontein, it was on a cold winter's morning.
It was freezing cold, and I'm coming from this hot climate in Israel, and it was grim. All the smoke from all the chimneys were coming up, and the station was so miserable, and the town looked like a little hick town, like a little village.
And I had to get a taxi to take us to my parents' home.
I look around and I said to Morris, "Are you sure you didn't miss the station? Is that the place that we came?" "No," he says, "this is Bloemfontein."
Dead silence.
I wanted to go right back into the train and go back.
And I brought her to a land where English was the language and she couldn't speak English. The problem was to get her to teach her how to speak English.
And I stayed for 42 years. Eventually I became a principal of the school, and I carried on.
While I was courting her, she told me she had been a Holocaust survivor. As a bit of a shock, to hear about what had happened to her.
I wanted children, I really did. Even during the war, I always said to myself, I haven't lived yet. I don't know anything about anything. I want children. I want to make up for all those millions of children that were killed, murdered.
We were aware of what happened. We were aware of which family members we had lost. We knew this was always in the background, but the detail we didn't know.
I didn't talk about the Holocaust to my sons, not to my husband.
Of a time in the concentration camps, she often had nightmares, and she woke up screaming, and I had to sort of console her and try to settle her down during the nights.
My 24-year-old son, Richard, when he was still at school, I think he was 17 years of age, he had the privilege of going on the March of the Living. And he went first to Israel, and then he went to the various camps that my mother had been in. And it was quite poignant because he celebrated his 17th birthday at Majdanek, which is where my mother had her 17th birthday. So she was there as an inmate, and he was there as a visitor to see where she had been. And then subsequently, I think he also, I forget the exact sequence, but he also visited Auschwitz, the camp Auschwitz, which I think is better preserved. And I subsequently heard that he phoned his grandmother and said, well, I'm standing at the gates of Auschwitz. Where were you in Auschwitz? And she said, I will direct you to the bungalow. And he was able to, on the cell phone, get directions to where his grandmother had been within the camp.
I didn't want to influence their lives with my past and my suffering. If they asked a question, I answered it, but I never discussed it, and I could hear everywhere people talking about second generation syndrome of the Holocaust, and the kids were affected if the parents both were in the camps and never stopped talking about it. And I didn't want them to grow up with any complexes. I don't know if I made a mistake or not, but that's how it was.
She gave me a birthday present. She said, you know what the best birthday present I ever received? And I always thought at that age, what was it? Was it a jersey? Was it a sweatshirt? Was it this? And she said, no, it was a piece of bread. And I know from she told you the story of one day in the Holocaust where it was a birthday and her closest friend had disappeared for the whole day. And she was cross with her friend because she wanted her friend to spend time with her in the camp. And it was freezing and it was cold, and her friend completely disappeared. And at 6 o'clock at night, the friend came back and said, yeah, I've been working in the labor environment to earn you an extra piece of bread for your birthday. Here's your birthday present. And I think for me, that was the most telling story that she told me at my early days of manhood. That little story made me realize the values of life. And still I tell my children today, when it comes to that presents and gifts are not real gifts, but it's a gift of love, and it's a gift of just being yourself and enjoying life. And that one story stood with me and still sticks with me today as the one little lesson of many thousands one can learn from the concentration camps.
And you know, sometimes I wonder myself, was I there? Was it truth? Was I really there in that time in such places and lived through all these things? It can't be, but it is.
She came out of it, she started a new family, she started a new life, and she decided to give new messages.
There are lots of stories to tell, and they're so vivid.
That I want to say that I'm just so crazy about her, and I still want to be with her. And
I'm not a hero. I don't want to be remembered for anything special, just a good mother and a grandmother and a friend.